Welcome to this webisode of Roche's Virtual International Experience Exchange for Patient Organizations. With IEEPO 2020 having gone fully virtual, we have turned the content of what would have been discussed in Berlin this year into exciting virtual formats. Webisodes like this one have replaced the 6 original learning labs. They feature members of the IEEPO community and are available for viewing or download on ieepo.com. They contain discussion questions and links to related resources, such as e-posters, submitted by patient organizations from around the world. This webisode will explore the potential for augmented intelligence and machine learning to improve patient care. And I'm delighted to welcome Andrea Ferris and Peter Bannister. Let me start with a few words about our two speakers. You can find their full bios on ieepo.com. Andrea Ferris is the president and CEO of the Longevity Foundation, which funds translational research into both early detection and more effective treatments of lung cancer. Longevity has also built the largest grassroots network of events and patient advocates in the United States. Peter Bannister is the executive chair of the healthcare sector at the Institute of Engineering and Technology. He engages with the public and policymakers to explain how technology can help address society's healthcare challenges, while also ensuring that engineers can effectively collaborate with patients and clinicians. Peter, let me start by asking you the first question. What is augmented intelligence? What is artificial intelligence? And what is machine learning?
That's a great question to start with. Before I talk about augmented intelligence, I think it's worth focusing first on artificial intelligence, which is a term that's been around for a long time and I think means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. We hear a lot about artificial intelligence being applied to healthcare, particularly over the last few years. And artificial intelligence is a very general term which refers to giving computers the ability to think and to reason and to behave in a way that's human-like. When we talk about artificial intelligence in healthcare, almost all of the time what we're really talking about is a specific form of artificial intelligence known as machine learning. Machine learning is a way of programming computers, not by giving them a set of rules to follow, but by giving them lots of examples of a task and asking the computer to work out its own rules for performing that task going forwards. Another term that is heard a lot these days is deep learning. Deep learning is a very specific type of machine learning which can handle very large data sets, which makes it well suited for a lot of problems in healthcare, where we might be dealing with a lot of patient data, whether it's imaging or electronic patient records. So there's a lot of different ways that we can go from the hype maybe of artificial intelligence down to something more real, in this case, machine learning, of which deep learning is a subset. I believe that when we talk about augmented intelligence, we're recognizing that the most productive way of using tools like machine learning in a healthcare setting is for them to boost the existing abilities of both patients and clinicians rather than replacing them. So it's another tool available to them, much like a stethoscope, which they can then use alongside the specialist skills that they as human beings have to bring to solving healthcare's challenges.
So Peter, can I ask you a question with that? So if I understood it correctly, then
Sure.
Artificial intelligence is somewhat of a what we would envision Hollywood to be, where you have machines and robots who can think and feel and act, correct? And so that's artificial intelligence, which is the holy grail way out there. Then the machine learning or deep learning, which is very related to this whole concept of big data and gathering a lot of data. And it's really to have a robust amount of information that a machine could then go in and look for patterns or do some sort of deep recognition on it. And then the augmented intelligence is when we apply algorithms or some sort of methodology or formula to then analyze that deep data, and it helps to assist in making evaluations or routine care, evaluating screens or things like that. Is that a good way of thinking about it from sort of a layman's perspective?
It's recognizing that it's not just the computer on its own, it's the computer in tandem with an expert, whether that's a patient or a clinician, allowing the individual to do more than they would be able to do without the benefit of pattern recognition and automation.
Because the human mind can't sort through that amount of data by itself in a timely way.
Exactly. I mean, a very great thing about this field is a lot of the applications are inherently visual.
Okay.
So image search or looking for cancer in a CT scan, for example. And as human beings, we're intrinsically very good at looking and understanding in 3 dimensions. We're not so good at understanding in more dimensions. So if you are having to look at someone's pulse and their blood pressure and their breathing rate and their medical image and a bunch of other stuff at the same time to make a decision, that's where we quickly get overwhelmed by that mass of data. And that's where machine learning can help us pull out those patterns and signals in much bigger data sets and help us make the right decision on a human-to-human basis.
So you don't have to be an expert necessarily. This can help you become the expert or to take what's in an expert's mind and to make similar decisions.
Absolutely. I think it's showing clear potential in both of those areas. One is making experts more consistent and giving them more information for them to then use their skills on in a way that they couldn't before. The other area is allowing more people to be experts by using the technology to bridge the skills gap, the experience gap between, let's say, a clinician who has seen the same kind of condition many, many times over years of a long career versus a newly trained doctor who has less real-world experience. So artificial intelligence, machine learning is being applied in some cases to help standardize the level of care and speed up training.
So, over to you now. You've heard Peter and Andrea on this topic, but what do you think? What types of artificial intelligence, machine learning, or deep learning do you know of that you believe can contribute to patients receiving better care?
So Peter, just quick question for you, just for a point of clarification. You use the word algorithm when we're talking about big data. So could you just explain how you're using algorithm and what it means when it comes to augmented intelligence and looking through big data and how they come to be?
Yes, of course. I think it's important to be really clear about what we mean by an algorithm. So an algorithm generally is a formula that takes some inputs and produces an output. So it could be, as you say, a prescribing formula where based on some patient characteristics, it will calculate or suggest the right therapeutic. In machine learning, it's essentially the same thing. It's a formula that is written down as computer code that, again, can take inputs, whether those are images or electronic patient data, perform a calculation on them, and produce an output or a prediction. So an algorithm is, in the context of today's conversation, a piece of software that converts an observation and input into an output or a prediction.
So just with that then, obviously if it's a formula, it was created by humans. And so how do you account for bias or human error so that you don't get the wrong output that people then rely on? There have been several articles recently about how there's sort of inherent bias, particularly racial bias, in a lot of the algorithms that were being used that people hadn't anticipated before. So how do you account for that and prevent that to the degree possible?
So in general, with a formula, the way that you account for bias is you need to test it on a very representative set of examples. So for example, if your formula is meant to work correctly on people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, then what you should do is demonstrate that with examples from people from each of those backgrounds that it produces the correct output. Now, bias is something that's talked about a lot within machine learning, because the advantage of machine learning is that you don't have to write down an explicit formula. What you're saying to the computer is, here are lots of examples of people who've got a particular condition. I don't know what in this data tells me that they've got that condition, but I know that they are all examples of that particular condition. Let's say people who've got lung cancer. And what you're then doing with enough technical competence is you're giving all of those examples to the computer and you're saying, you go and find the patterns that make all of those examples. You go and find the patterns that are similarities between those examples, so that when I give you new data in the future, if you find the same pattern that was common to all of those examples, you can say that's another example of someone, in this case, who's got lung cancer. Bias is an issue there, because while you're handing over the learning to the computer and not biasing it by saying what to look for in that data, you are biasing it in terms of the actual data that you give it. So if you only gave it examples from people from a particular ethnic background, it would inherently only learn how to find cancer in people from that ethnic background. And the risk, very much so, is that if you then gave it data in the future from people from a different ethnic background, it may not perform correctly. And in this case, it might say that someone has got cancer when they haven't, or that they haven't got cancer when they have. And from a clinical perspective, that's clearly catastrophic. Bias, when we talk about machine learning, is making sure that the data with which you train your algorithm, your formula, is fully representative of the kind of people, patients, you are going to run it on in the future and offer it to as part of their care.
And how often do they have to be updated? Because the science moves so fast in many diseases, cancer being one of them, particularly with personalized healthcare and precision medicine. There's it's exponential how quickly new things are being learned and discovered. So how frequently and how easy or difficult is it to enter new information into an algorithm or to retrain it, so to speak?
I think conceptually, in terms of designing new algorithms, that moves quite quickly. There's a lot of people working in machine learning today, and many of them are interested in how it can be used to help healthcare. So in terms of the computer scientists needed to retrain the algorithms, there are lots of them available. So in principle, we've got the ability to throw new types of data at algorithms, at formulas, and improve them potentially by adding in that new intelligence. Where things move more slowly is when they're actually being applied in day-to-day clinical care. Because the machine learning, as we're describing it in a healthcare setting, very often is classified in the same way as any other medical device, whether that be a scalpel or a life support system. It needs to be safe and it needs to be effective, and hence it's very heavily regulated. And it does take some time to rerun all of the testing, which could potentially include clinical trials, once you've updated one of these machine learning algorithms, to show that it still is safe and effective. So you might think it's a great idea to add in the new information, but you still need to go back and repeat all the testing that you did on the original algorithm before you can then roll it out live to patients and to clinicians. So things tend to move a lot slower when they're actually being deployed into clinical settings. I think you're talking sort of 6 months to 2 years in terms of a regulatory sense. And that then depends on
Right.
What are you using the machine learning for? If it's to provide some additional information which the clinician or the patient can use to help them make decisions of their own, it might not take so long. The burden of proof on what that particular machine learning algorithm is doing might be lower. If, however, you've come up with a new piece of software that takes some information in and makes a diagnosis
Right.
on which someone's future care is going to be determined, then there is a much higher burden of proof that it does that consistently and correctly every time. And that's when you're starting to talk potentially about months in the case of rerunning lots of testing, or potentially longer if for some reason you have to go and carry out a new clinical trial.
How about for more, I guess, internal purposes or scientific purposes, for like drug discovery or something like that? I would imagine then it's less time intensive to modify algorithms if it's being used for internal purposes, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up as an application area. So the initial enthusiasm about machine learning in healthcare was around images, because there's lots of images, more images are being produced every year. How has anyone
Right.
possibly got enough time to review all of those images? But what's happened even faster than that on the heels of it has been its adoption within the pharmaceutical industry. We mentioned looking for patterns, pattern recognition earlier, and as you know, the early stage drug discovery process is all about finding candidate molecules or candidate drugs that could be repurposed for a particular therapeutic response. And that's where, outside of the regulatory environment, that early stage discovery, that's where machine learning can really move at pace and is now being used in increasing frequency by pharmaceuticals, vaccine developers, to speed up that early discovery process by orders of magnitude in some cases, to start to identify those candidates which can then go into physical early phase trials. Clearly, with those kind of development programs, a huge amount of time and money is spent on traditional approaches, and ultimately that means it takes longer for a drug to get to the patient once it's gone through the full development process. That economy of scale, we're seeing starting to see some really big wins in terms of machine learning, deep learning being used to speed up that early discovery phase, save a lot of time, save a lot of money for the manufacturers, and ultimately get these solutions out to the patient a lot quicker. We're still in the early days of that. There's very few, if any, drugs that have been proposed through a machine learning early discovery process that have finished the full clinical trial phase, but we're starting to see candidate molecules going in to that early phase and progressing in a way that you would expect candidates that had been discovered by traditional methods to do as well.
Peter, I have another question for you. You've talked about a few examples, most recently with the drug discovery, but where does it make sense in your mind to use augmented intelligence, both from a clinical perspective, I guess more on the clinical side of things? You had mentioned scans, you had mentioned some other things. So could you just give some concrete examples of where it makes sense to use augmented intelligence in today's world?
Absolutely, Andrea. I think the technical and the clinical and patient communities have come to an agreement quite rapidly over the last few years about where it does make sense to use machine learning in an augmented intelligence sense. And where that is in two areas in particular. One is helping standardize and automate tasks that are already very well understood and can be carried out very successfully by a suitably trained expert. The second is in actually bringing to the surface a higher level of detailed information that was previously available. So if there are subtle and underlying patterns, nonetheless consistent patterns in medical data, which aren't easily detectable by a trained expert, can machine learning, as it's starting to show it can it highlight those patterns and present them to an expert like a clinician in a way that they can then use that additional information to help make better decisions than they were able to previously. Standardization and automation is one key area, and then enhanced information and decision making is the other.
So like here in the US, particularly with precision medicine and in some cancers, you have very few doctors who are very, very knowledgeable, and they know a lot, and their information goes deep because they do all the research on it. They have this depth of expertise. Yet 80% of our population is treated in a community center by a non-specialist. They're treated by a general oncologist. So how realistic, as diseases become more and more targeted and specialized in the science and the medicine becomes so precise, and the diagnostics needed in order to get there also becomes very precise and very complex. How realistic is it that we can use augmented intelligence to help to interpret that, such that a general oncologist or a non-specialist will be able to know what to do with the information, similar to what an expert would do? So use the expert in all of their information to train the model, if you will, so that a non-specialist can use it. So I guess two questions with that. One is, how realistic is it? And two is, what are the concerns or watch outs of doing that?
Sure. So how realistic is that? I think we can answer that in two ways. There's an early win, if you like, in terms of with today's standard of care, how do we make that the standard? So how do we make sure that someone in a resource-deprived environment has access to as close to standard of care that someone in a very well-provisioned healthcare environment would? And there are growing numbers of examples of augmented intelligence being made available in that form. So, for example, radiotherapy planning, It's a very manual process, drawing around the areas of the patient that may or may not need to receive the treatment. And it's very skill intensive, and really the quality of care you receive is very much biased by where you're being seen, what country and what centre.
Right.
But it's a task that ultimately can be automated to some degree and is being done so successfully, so that centres who don't have the same level of skill within their staff at the moment, or the breadth of skills, can close the gap in terms of the quality of treatment planning in this case. And there are a lot of other examples. Another one is, for example, in breast cancer screening, there are a number of companies who have developed software which is used to assist the reading of diagnostic breast cancer scans. In many countries, the requirement is for 2 clinicians to review the scan to ensure that nothing is missed. That in itself places a huge resource burden on first world countries as well as other countries. So there have been a number of augmented intelligence machine learning solutions that have been brought to market which automate the second scan. So you have the algorithm as your backup, as your agreement. So it still has an expert in the loop, a human being, but they can leverage this automation to help them. So I think that's very much in terms of taking the best of what we have today and using this technological approach to make that best of today available to as many people as possible across the globe. I think within that you mentioned the potential for more sophisticated treatments, things like precision medicine approaches being more widespread. I think that can progress almost independently of this bringing up the standard of care globally. So there are opportunities to apply that in more and more clinical settings independently from however long it takes us to bring first world care to third world parts of the globe, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think there's opportunities in both directions. I think there is a general and completely justified concern that if we hand over the clinical decision making to an algorithm, that will create more risk than it brings benefit. It's interesting that when machine learning first started to make its way into the consciousness of the clinical community, much of it through radiology, that a very famous machine learning computer scientist stood up at a conference and said, in the future, we won't need to train radiologists. Computers will do all the work. And that was only 4 years ago. And the message now is, we won't need to train radiologists who don't understand how to use machine learning. We'll be training radiologists who know how to take advantage of augmented intelligence, because it would appear the only way to get precision medicine care to everyone is with the help of technology. So it's interesting to understand how that message has changed, and what that's allowed the technical community to do is to bring on board patients and clinicians to work together, to collaborate, to actually come up with solutions for real problems, and together to improve the standard of care. The other area where it doesn't make sense to use these technologies is where you're not absolutely certain about what you're doing with the data. And what I mean by that is there are many legitimate concerns around the use of personal data. Could that data be used for unethical purposes? So, for example, if an algorithm was able to analyze a CCTV image of you and based on your facial characteristics predict whether you had a disease, the risk might be that if an insurance company got hold of that algorithm, they could start to disqualify people from being insured, because they knew, even before the patient did, that they had a particular condition. So data in the wrong hands is a very real risk, because by bringing together all of this data to train machine learning, you need to make sure that it's appropriately safeguarded as well, and it's only used in a way that's consistent with the consent of the patient or the healthcare provider who gave it to you in the first place.
Okay, you completely just horrified me there with that whole concept of using CCTV. But that actually raises a really interesting question and point, though, and about privacy and about data and where the data comes from to train it. And is there a governing body that's like for ethics? Like, how do you control that machine learning or augmented intelligence is not used for those things.
It's the ethics of machine learning and artificial intelligence is a very rapidly evolving field, and it's linked very, very closely to policy as well. Data protection itself is a fairly well understood field, and organizations and such as the FDA in the United States and regulations such as the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR in Europe, or HIPAA in the States, have existed for a long time to generally protect the use of patient data, for example, to make sure that it's appropriately anonymized if it's going to be used in a research setting or in the public domain. So the ethics is a really important question, and this is where not just patients and clinicians and computer scientists are getting together, but philosophers and policymakers are talking and trying to come up with rules for these. So it's a rapidly emergent area. There are a number of bodies globally who are now focused on the ethical use of generally digital health. So any healthcare application where data is needed to deliver improved care, specifically because artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning need so much data in that particular area. So there's a lot of scrutiny on that. I don't think there's an international standard as yet, but there are growing regional standards which are largely consistent with each other about how to use this, how to use these techniques. I think an interesting area is clinical trials themselves. So a lot of people who've been innovating in this space come from a computer science background. They're not clinicians. And for a while, people who'd come from that software development background where it was break it early, beta test using your customers, is not remotely appropriate for a healthcare setting. I don't want to be beta tested on if my care depends on it, and I'm sure no one else here does either. It was initially a bit of a culture clash, but now a reconciliation between the potential to build things fast. There are now standards out there for clinical trials of artificial intelligence. So there is now agreement in terms of how do you clinically evaluate algorithms, and how do you decide whether or not they work or not. And those kind of reporting standards also make sure that if you get a bad result, you've got to tell people about it.
It's a bit of a conundrum, really, because if back to clinical trials, they're not representative generally of the populations which ultimately benefit from the drugs. And there's a lot of work going on to make them more representative, but it's a bit of, with respect to the data, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you're not going to be using a complete set of data to train something or to do the pattern recognition, it's hard to get that. So it is hugely important and incumbent on patients, patient advocates, and others as well to help to inform and educate about the benefits of sharing your data and where to share it or whom to share it with, and what can be done with that in a pretty robust way, I think is kind of essential in order to help with enabling augmented intelligence reach its full potential. Because if you're not going to have the data to train it on, it's not going to work.
You're right, it's entirely dependent on the data. And as an individual, I'm as concerned about whether or not my data is being used correctly and my privacy being safeguarded in the same way as anyone else out there.
Right.
And it just takes one headline about a data breach, even if it's not in healthcare, to sort of set everyone back mentally and think, am I really safe to share my data? Is it being used for good? Which comes back to fundamental clinical principles about do no harm, which is why these are now being applied more specifically to the opportunities that are presented by these algorithms. I think we talked about bias. Bias is something that these new reporting guidelines very explicitly consider. And there are a number of national health services across the globe who are now in the process of establishing standard and representative data sets on which these new machine learning approaches need to be tested before they can be rolled out on those populations. So that gives an opportunity to make sure as far as possible that these algorithms have been systematically tested and are able to support a diverse population. There's also a term that's becoming more, there's a term that's becoming more widely used, which is digital health inequality, which recognizes that some countries fundamentally are better set up to be able to collect, manage data across many, many different sources, coming back to the precision medicine example. And hence, if not properly managed, there is going to be an increasing health inequality arising because some countries are going to be able to benefit more and more from these techniques, and the algorithms at the end of the day are going to only be trained on their data, so they're only going to be suitable for that population.
Yep.
While the have-nots are going to be pushed further and further out of the picture, and coming full circle, those are the people who stand the most to benefit today from standardizing that care, making sure that the global expert skills are available to everyone, regardless of background, demographics or geographical location. One of the great things today is you're seeing some very, very strong multidisciplinary collaborations across the globe. People who realize that you've got to have this multifaceted solution. It's got to be the ethics, it's got to be the policy, it's got to be the regulation, it's got to be the clinical, and it's got to be the patient as well. I think what's fundamental to being able to collaborate in that way with people across different backgrounds and different experiences and different roles, different stakeholders, is speaking a common language, which is why today's webinar and conversations like this are really important. It's all too easy to get sucked into using buzzwords like AI, deep learning, and people, if they don't really understand what they mean, they can't ask questions about them, and they can't then work out whether that's actually going to be a benefit to them. There's some near-term opportunities where we can all work together, and with what we've got today, we can solve some problems. But actually, I think another benefit is by educating patients, clinicians, and regulators and others on what the technology really can do, what its strengths, but also what its limitations are. That then means as individually we move forwards and come across new problems in our everyday life in terms of delivering health and care for all, we now have another tool in our toolbox. And maybe machine learning is not the right solution, but if it is, at least the clinician or the patient now understands what machine learning really can do, and they can then make a decision much closer to the problem as to whether or not it's an appropriate tool to use in solving that.
And I think in just listening to you in your approach and what you're saying, kudos to you, and I compliment you. I think it's the most important thing that is essential in all of this is that people listen. It's not just that they come in and think that they know the answer and that they have a way of fixing it, but they really listen to the other stakeholders. And in my view, the most important stakeholder is the patient and their families, to understand what they think the problem is, and then to apply their information to help solve that, even if it might not be the fanciest or the coolest or the most advanced thing that they can do. It's the right thing to do because that's what's important. And I think listening is, as you're doing, is essential, and not enough people do it.
And I think iterating is also very important. So it's not just about having one conversation. It's about maybe going away, developing a machine learning piece of software that tries to solve the problem you thought you heard, and taking it back and testing your assumptions with the patient or the clinician, and then improving it. And then if new data comes along that might help, then you've got an opportunity to keep developing your solution.
On behalf of the Roche Global Patient Partnership Team and the IEEPO External Advisory Committee, thank you very much for being with us today. I'd like to thank Andrea and Peter for sharing their thoughts on opportunities and challenges around augmented intelligence and machine learning to improve patient care. You can learn more about Peter and Andrea and download the e-posters for this session on IEEPO.com. You can also check out other webisodes focusing on the power of data and the digitalization of healthcare. And we're adding regular updates, so stay tuned and check back regularly for more around this and other topics. Thank you very much.